Let's bring in another couple of voices on this. Former U.S. Senator Evan Bayh is here with us on set about this. Also, Mattie Duppler, who is National Taxpayers Union Senior Fellow. Evan, what do you think? I mean, how do you navigate your party, the Democratic Party, when you hear statistics like this?
Well, I think a couple things, Becky. First, what's the old saying? If you're not liberal when you're young, you don't have a heart. But if you're not a little more conservative when you're older, you don't have a head.
Right.
So I think young people, as they have experience being entrepreneurs, seeing how people really create businesses and opportunities, will learn a little bit, and perhaps their views will change.
Is that the Democratic version? A little more conservative? I don't think that was part of the original. But if you feel better with that, saying it that way, that's okay.
A couple of other things. I think for our country's sake, it's a good thing that the United States Senate is a little older demographic. The average age is like 64.
Okay, boomer.
So I think a wealth tax is probably not going to go anywhere. But there are some legitimate things we need to focus on. So many young people today come out of school with huge amounts of debt, and I think that may color their views about things some. We need to find a way to make access to higher education more affordable, so that's not going on. And with the huge disparities in wealth that we're generating today, we need to find a way to, and I hope we can convince young people, even in my party, Joe, to lift up rather than to level down. And that's great.
I get confused who your party is. You're an Indiana Democrat, and we've been on a lot of times. You don't recognize this party.
Well, I've been accused of sometimes being a Republicrat, somewhere in the middle.
Right, like a dino.
Well, look, the truth, at least in my experience, very often is somewhere in the middle. So we do need to focus upon how to create opportunity in our society. And I would encourage young people to look at some Western European societies and elsewhere where the youth unemployment rate is 20, 25, 30%. That's really not a place we want to go. So how do we harness markets? How do we encourage entrepreneurism in ways that more people can participate in, rather than emphasizing jealousy, envy, and just taking from people who've been successful? That's not really a path toward long-term success.
Evan, I think both parties want exactly what you have just said. The question is, does the government take somebody like Michael's wealth and redistribute it? I think of Bill Gates, probably the most consequential person in the history of the world with respect to philanthropic activities. If the government had taken that, would it have had the great impact? If the government had taken Michael's wealth, would the government have had the social justice impact that Michael's been able to have? I think that's the debate we're having. It's not what the desires are. We all want happiness for the greatest number of people. I'm just curious, do you think the Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders way of achieving that is the right way for our country? And will it fly next November in states bordering Indiana? Because that's what really matters. Michigan, Ohio, so on and so forth. Not Ohio, pardon me. Michigan, principally Wisconsin, so on and so forth.
Well, you won't be surprised to learn that I'm not in the Bernie Elizabeth camp. I'm not for marginal tax rates at 70, 80, 90%. I'm not for just confiscating people's wealth because they happen to have been successful. There is, however, a legitimate debate about how progressive the tax code should be and how we go about generating the income the government needs to fund opportunity for those who are not as successful as the most successful people in our society, how equitably to do that. And that's a legitimate debate that we should have. But I'm not for, just confiscating people's wealth with the wealth tax. I'm not for the so-called death tax. But paying more along the way to try and fund good things. And here's the key. And where I'm from, Joe, out in the hinterland, Becky's home state, people are for funding education, quality health care, that kind of thing. But they know that inherently government, because government is not subject to a market discipline, government tends to be inefficient. It can be wasteful. So how do we hold government accountable? That's the key word. Accountable toward taking those tax dollars and investing them in ways that actually produce the results that taxpayers want. That's the key. Markets tend to, have disproportionate outcomes. Government tends to be wasteful. How do we find that sweet spot in the middle? I think that's what most voters want.
Mattie, you've been waiting patiently. You want to weigh in?
I sure do. Well, the debate that's happening around the table right now is not the debate that's happening in the Democratic primary. This conversation about the proper size and scope of government, I think a lot of Americans do want to have that debate. But what's happening right now when you talk about wealth taxes and the politics of envy is a conversation about essentially what kind of government we think we should have. And the fact of the matter is that when you come to socialism and capitalism, that Cato poll was really interesting because actually actually, young people think favorably about socialism the same way they think favorably about capitalism. What's not surprising about that poll is that young people are in favor of taxing people who they don't think are them. There's this otherizing effect that we always see in these polls when it comes to taxing people. I mean, even Bernie Sanders, right, wanted to tax millionaires before he became a millionaire. Now his wealth tax doesn't kick in until about $32 million. There's a reason for that. It's because there's always support when you think someone else is the one paying the bill. I think the conversation about entrepreneurship is particularly instructive here. Americans now, particularly young Americans who make up the largest part of the American workforce, are people who came of age during the Great Recession, and that was an extremely formative experience that has in some senses set them back.
So you don't think they grow out of it, in other words?
Well, I do think they grow out of it, but I do think they just have a unique perspective that our political and financial thinking really hasn't accommodated because there's been 10 years where they feel their financial futures have been delayed. They feel that there is something missing for the economy, in the economy for them. But as a result of that, most millennials are a lot more entrepreneurial, which means business taxes are going to hit them a lot more sensitively. They're going to be exposed to something like an increase in the payroll tax, which we hear a lot about from some of these Democrats running for president. You know, when you talk about taxes on wealth, when you talk about taxes on high-income earners, people think that's just on the income side of things. But when you think about the complexity in business taxes, that's something that young people will be a lot more exposed to a lot earlier than other generations.